Well, Maggie, I stand corrected, and I think we stand corrected. One of the first Substack bonus episodes we did was me writing this carefully plotted diatribe saying, I hate the multiverse, it sucks, it's never been done well, it's a terrible idea, it's the death of art, my normal passion.
It was totally right.
I still think it's right.
It was valid.
But I stand corrected, and I think the next 20 minutes is you and I eating crow a little bit, because this movie was fantastic.
It was so good. And I feel like I've said this, I'm so confused by myself because I feel like we've talked about so many like superhero properties, and I always preface it with, I hate superheroes, but this was actually good. And like, maybe I just hate Marvel. Like maybe I just hate the Avengers. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe I just hate the Avengers.
You know who's an Avenger?
No, I don't want to talk about that. I'm talking about like the 2012 Avengers.
You mean live action?
Yeah, I suppose. Listen, that's not the point. The point is this was amazing. This was so good.
And it was Marvel.
And it was Spider-Man.
Right.
Whose story has been told 4 trillion times.
Yes.
And I do not care at all.
But that's why it works, because that is part of this story.
Right. Yeah.
So we're talking about Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, the Miles Morales movie that just came out a couple weeks ago.
Should we also share, we didn't see the first one. Like we watched a recap of it and we read, because we were like, I don't want to commit to 2 movies, and we needed to see this before it left theaters, so we decided.
Spent 2 weeks trying to talk Maggie into seeing this at all.
I was just like, oh, it's another one.
And I read her the Wikipedia page on the way to the movie.
Yeah. So we were like, I was like, okay, I can follow along with this.
We had the same conversation 10 times. It was me saying, but it has all these cool animation styles and all these different interpretations. And Maggie would go, but it's Spider-Man.
And I would say, and for what?
It's
And it turns out this was great. And I really want to watch the first one now.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
So yeah,
I stand corrected. I was wrong. My opinion is always right, except for right now, and I'm gonna own that.
We saw this, laughed the whole time, loved it. There were some jaw-dropping art styles and designs that we'll get into.
Beautiful.
But when we left the theater, we were just happy and buzzing.
Yeah, we were like, that was a really fantastic movie.
Yeah,
I loved every part of that.
We sat on it for a few days, and then yesterday I just wrote out a bunch of thoughts. And these are not just my thoughts. I roped in a lot of the things Maggie and I discussed in the car ride home.
Did some mind reading.
That's the first draft of every podcast, is the car ride home from the movie.
Truly.
So, yeah, I think one of the most enjoyable parts of the discussion that we had before is realizing that this movie is the new market leader for animation. This Spider-Verse series.
Yeah. Why do we think that what is it called? Hot and Cold Elemental. Why do we think Elemental is doing so poorly?
Exactly.
It's so lifeless compared to this.
Style is the thing that I took away from this movie. Just jaw-dropping style, speed, color, life, this sense of freedom and excitement. And comparing that to like the Elemental trailer, which we've seen a bunch of times because we keep going to see movies.
Yeah.
Which feels like a copy of a copy of a copy.
Yeah.
In that same one art style that we've seen for like 15 years. Or even the Mario movie, which you and I both loved. That was fully within the Illumination Nintendo sandbox.
Totally, it was.
It
was a really good like execution of that, but it wasn't doing much new.
It was an established brand and style with like a whole new level of budget, polish, and refinement.
Sure,
it's really good, but it very much had that DNA.
But it wasn't like I didn't come out of the Mario movie going, that was a fantastic movie. I just came out going, that was really fun. I really enjoyed that. But I came out of this like, that was a good movie. Like, not just it was a fun kids movie. Like, it was a good movie.
Mario was 90 minutes. It was great. I loved it. It was a fun roller coaster. The darkness of it was surprising. Like, kind of dark humor was really gratifying. I loved it. Got off the roller coaster ride and then moved on with my life. Like, that one was not an episode.
I didn't think about it after.
Spider-Verse is something new.
Yeah.
And it's not just one new thing. It's constant new things. The color shifts that you get throughout scenes. The scenes of Gwen and her dad. The way the color evolves on the walls throughout those scenes.
Oh my gosh, they're so good.
The way there's like this watercolor bleed through different art styles. You see art styles explode onto the scene and then fade away within a minute. Something that's so dazzling, they just move on to the next thing.
Totally.
This was one great movie, but it also felt like 100 movies.
Right.
Like it was, it reminded me of the animation you and I grew up with, because we hit a really good sweet spot in the kind of golden age of Disney animation back when it was 2D and hand-drawn.
The 90s. Yeah.
Where it felt relentlessly creative.
Yes,
like
and each movie had its own specific, unique style. And, like, you could see any still from any of those movies, even if, like, without the principal characters in it, and know which movie it is, because the styles were so distinct and special.
And this was distinct. Like, it didn't have one identity where you would recognize it in a second. Like, there's been this discourse the last few weeks about Wes Anderson. Like, you know when you see it, it's one distinct thing.
Totally.
This has so many different identities running through it.
That's what it was doing differently from, like, the 90s Disney movies, was that it has a unique style, but it's so much... It's so much more flexible within that style. Like, even like throughout the movie, you know, like depending on which universe you're in, the art style changes. But even within the same universe, there's so much more room and flexibility in that style. Like they'll change up the character model a bit, or they'll change up the coloring or the backgrounds or the line work or something, even within that universe's specific style, because it's just like the whole movie is just an appreciation for a love letter to comics and drawing and animation.
It's always like, whether I love that point, because you're changing eras. Some things look distinctly retro. I mean, that medieval vulture, like, pulled it back to Da Vinci, that kind of
that's
hand drawn
but not
on
medieval.
the, like,
Sorry, I have to say it.
All those, like, when the paper looks like tea stained, and you've got all those scratchy line work.
I mean, it looks like all of Da Vinci's sketchbooks.
The Vitruvian Man kind of thing with all of the etchings and sketchings. You change eras, you change medium. There's this texture on screen, and all of those shifts, they always feel like they're in the name of story, or like what you just suggested, expression. It's all serving the characters.
Yes.
And I think that's what really reminded me of the Disney era you and I got to grow up in. Every creative choice here felt inspired, which makes this like a carefully, impeccably curated kaleidoscope. Because it could have been just a mess of color and styles. It could have been just this hodgepodge smoothie, but it's not. It's incredibly cohesive.
Yeah.
And
it is.
I'm so glad we saw this in a theater.
Oh, me too.
I really think it was sort of a dazzling, killer experience there.
Yeah, it was so much fun.
Like, I caught my jaw being open.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen. That's too much of a meme at this point
like,
to
really,
actually happen.
Yeah.
But there were moments like, why am I breathing through my mouth?
It's like, this is amazing. Yeah.
Oh, it's hanging open.
Yeah.
But also, and this is the part where we're kind of eating crow a little bit, the story.
Right. The story was so good.
This is a great multiverse story.
Right. Like, by the time I had accepted, like, yeah, I'll go see this movie, I was like, I'm going to really enjoy and appreciate the aesthetics of this movie. I'm going to love the style. That's going to be fun. I'm going to notice, like, now that I'm so much more well-versed in comics, I'm going to recognize any, homages to it. And that's going to be great. Whatever. I did not expect to give a single shit about the story. And I cared so much, because the characters were so good. Like, that's something that I've realized is very big for me. Not that makes me special or unique, but characters are so important for me. Like, if I don't connect with the characters, I do not care what's happening in the plot. Like, I just will not care. And Miles is such a charming, sympathetic, special, multifaceted person. And what's her name? Gwen is fantastic. I loved Gwen. She was so interesting. Her dad was interesting. Miles' parents were both really, really good. And even Peter, who we don't get to see much in this one, I think he's much more heavily featured in the first movie. He was really interesting. And even the future, the spider guy who turns out to be bad. What's his name?
Spider-Man 2099.
Yeah, he was really interesting. Like, really good character work. Like, that's what made me so invested in this story.
The villains too.
Right. Yeah.
The Spot starting as this sort of goofy villain, and he knows that.
Yes.
And the way that kind of self-awareness turns.
Yeah.
And it corrodes in him and makes him this kind of vengeful, wrathful being. That was awesome. And he kept calling himself the Nemesis, and by the end you believed it. That was a fun arc for a villain.
Totally.
Instead of just that same autopilot end of the world thing. Yeah, this was...
Yeah, and I loved that we opened with Gwen, and we got really attached to her and what's going on with her story. Because I mean, again, this is a sequel, right? So I'm thinking, okay, we're already invested in Miles if we've seen the first one. So now let's give Gwen a little moment of her own and get us really invested in her. And then the movie really feels like a 2-person lead movie. I mean, it's still very much Miles' story, but Gwen is so heavily important as well. I really liked that.
Yeah, and I know Miles from the games.
Right.
And this was a Marvel production, but it's mostly a Sony thing.
Yeah.
Because Sony has all those Spider-Man rights.
Yes, that's so complicated.
And they have that same level of control over the games, the PlayStation games, the Spider-Man 2018, and then the Miles spinoff. And I just played the Miles spinoff.
Cool. Yeah.
But that's how I met the character. The way he's introduced in the first game, where, I mean, spoilers, I guess. It's a different version of the world, but
here, which is the whole point.
Miles' dad is alive.
Right.
Here. Also, that Miles does have a little cameo in the movie.
Oh, does he?
Yeah, because the developer's Insomniac. And I saw Insomniac Spider-Man in one of those little cards.
Oh, cute.
Those little text boxes on the screen.
I missed that. That's cute.
But in that version of the story, you meet Miles through his dad. And they kill the dad in that story. Here, he's still alive, which is weird for me because I only know this one version of the story.
Right.
But I fell in love with Miles when I didn't expect to. I thought I would just resent any character who wasn't Peter. I barely enjoyed MJ in the game, but I loved Miles. So I went into this movie loving that version of him, and I thought that there was an incredible kind of brand cohesion between the game and the movie, where they're telling different stories, they're on different timelines, but there's still that identity. For as much as the movie shifts and changes and tweaks, it still felt like Miles.
Yeah.
And I loved him. I thought he was fantastic.
Yeah, totally.
And it's the compliment to this being a great multiverse story is that it works in tandem with the constantly shifting art style.
Yes.
Because the multiverse aspect of the story, it doesn't just contextualize all of those changes in art style, it almost requires them. And then it becomes this dangerous sort of meta-narrative thing that we've talked about in the last few weeks, where it acknowledges those shifts and starts analyzing the variety in art styles, the similarities and differences between all of these different versions of the Spider-Man almost archetype more than character here. And it as we see these glimpses into each Spider-Person's universe, we create this theory. That's why Spider-Man 2099 is such a cool villain, because he starts as this mentor, but almost like a fourth wall level mentor, where he's the one tying together this web of the differences in each Spider-Person's universe.
Yeah.
You create this working theory of lore and story structure. And remember he introduces that concept of canon events? I thought that was an incredible just piece of analysis of the mythology that you seem bored of in the retellings.
Well, right. Like, that was my favorite thing. Like, apart from, like, my favorite thing about the plot, about the story of this movie was the whole concept of canon events and disrupting them. And, like, there was just a great amount of, or a great type of self-awareness in this movie. Like, we've talked before about the self-awareness that we can't stand in Marvel movies, the like self-deprecating ironic jokes and like, he's right behind me, isn't he, like that kind of thing, like, and that like weird self-awareness and like making jokes that undercut the drama and the seriousness of certain moments,
the same stale jokes that aren't funny. Right.
Like the self-awareness here of like recognizing that the story of Spider-Man has been told so many times, which I think the choice to make this movie about Miles and not Peter was really smart, because we've seen a million Peter Parkers in the last 10 years, not to mention, 60, 70 years. And so to choose a slightly different character, but to still acknowledge the origins, the legacy, and bring into question canon events, and like that's it. Like this idea of canon is another thing I've struggled with in comics in general, in superhero comics, is like, I think I've said before, I don't like how there's not one story. Like, there are 1,000 versions of things, and like that's where the multiverse thing starts to really bug me. I'm like, well, what's the story of Spider-Man if he's lived a million times? Like, I don't understand. But so acknowledging that, but then sort of like identifying, well, there are key things that happen in every Spider-Man story. Like the Uncle Ben has to die. The captain has to like die saving a child. A captain who's close to the spider person has to die. Gwen Stacy always dies, like that kind of thing. I liked them acknowledging and playing with that. I thought that was way more interesting than, I don't know, this is maybe not fair. I didn't see Spider-Man No Way Home, Long Way Home, long fucking
the Home trilogy.
The Homeward Bound. I don't fucking know that other one, right? I didn't see that, but what I know about that is, Spider-Man meets the other Spider-Man, and they all have a heart to heart.
Yeah.
I don't care, right? This is much more interesting because it's like it quickly is like, yeah, there are 1,000 other Spider people. Okay, that's established. Let's actually do something with it.
Right.
And like have the cute little cameos and fan service moments that make you laugh and give you the little warm fuzzies, but then don't make that the whole point.
It's pretty dangerous too. I mean, we've talked about this in a bunch of different ways over the years, but that's fun to be able to say now. It's dangerous to do that bit of commentary on a character, on legacy lore, to do that artistic analysis like what we do here. Anytime you do that within a story, I think you risk ruining the story.
Yeah.
Or it just becomes a podcast that's in a movie theater.
Right.
And it kind of stops being a story.
Then it takes you out of the story.
Right. It gets too meta and destroys the stakes or the immersion.
Yeah, but that didn't happen here.
No,
I was
not
in
at
the story
all.
the whole time because it was all like how it directly affected our characters.
Right. It had emotional stakes. And I think
Yeah.
that serves what you said before about wanting to care about the characters. Because you don't stop at the observations about canon events, about lore and story structure and how we all have to follow this model and it turns us into who we are. You engage with these looser questions that are so emotionally and almost philosophically rich, where you talk about the necessity of pain and loss as motivators.
Right.
For people trying to, basically they're trying to do good in the world and fix, I don't want to use like fight evil, but you know what they're trying to do. Like when they try to stop minor crimes that they see, just vaguely making the world a better place.
Yeah, even if it's in small ways.
And you end up in these discussions about engines of ambition, achievement, this emotional intelligence that they develop. It's a fantastic story built on fantastic characters.
Yeah.
That's how it works. That's how it has to work. And I was really impressed with, I think you alluded to this before, the balancing of storylines. Because I expected Miles to be the lead. I've seen posters, I've seen trailers.
Right, like he's the main character.
Miles is the guy.
It's his Spider-Man story, right.
And the fact that the movie starts with Gwen and that you get so much of her character.
Yeah, it's a long intro.
The way that, when you drop the title card and all that,
you're like, I
forgot we didn't get that already.
Yeah,
But I loved the balance of her and Miles.
Me too.
And then when you took these tangents with other characters, if you followed the villain for a minute or two, I'm always intrigued.
Yeah.
It didn't, again, just like the magic trick they pulled off in the games, and this is more of a compliment to the way Sony manages their brands, when they moved to Miles and his dad, I didn't feel like, I wish we were just with Peter still.
Right.
There's that same, they avoided my resentment.
Yes.
Just like the games did. It's a really, really skillful juggling.
Yeah.
We talked about this earlier. Maybe this is the note to end on, but we talked about jokes not working in a lot of modern MCU stuff. And this is not just us. This is the prevailing opinion online right now.
Yeah, it's not just us being contrarian.
And it's gotten worse. It's gotten more grating. You settle into the formula and there's a complacency.
Yeah.
You develop a style. That's why comedians have a shelf life and then we move on from
right,
them.
because it's not funny anymore. It gets boring.
It gets expected.
Yeah.
There's diminishing returns.
It's not ironic anymore if it's the norm.
Right.
You can't.
Right.
Yeah.
And even if it worked incredibly in the first few, that's why Robert Downey Jr. is
Sure. like Iron Man 1's a great movie.
Right.
Yeah.
When you see that template like 30 times, then it starts to fade for you.
Yes.
We can't end this episode without saying, this is some of the fastest, sharpest comedic dialogue probably ever in a superhero film.
It's very funny. And it also felt very contemporary and like of the time, like as in right now. Like I could, Cam and I are young millennials, right? But I could recognize,
I'm young.
Okay. Calm down now. So Miles, is if he's alive in our time, he's Gen Z, right? He's a teenager.
Right.
And so a lot of the humor and just conversation style among these characters felt to me very Gen Z, in as much as I understand that, right? But it didn't feel like, oh, this is a Gen Z movie. Like, it didn't feel so like specific to a certain generation or audience that I didn't feel connected. It was just very, very funny.
It followed one of my favorite rules in life that I don't see in movies enough because they are working from scripts. But the thing I love about jokes and telling jokes is the rudeness of it.
Yeah.
I like jokes that are mean.
Yes.
And more importantly, or maybe to that kind of comedy of manners point about rudeness, if you're talking with someone, if you and me are talking, if Tristan's there, if you have a joke, you get to interrupt whoever's talking.
Yes.
Because the funny thing takes supremacy.
Yes.
And the way these characters would just fire off lines or jokes or kind of undercut someone by saying something mean and funny, that is the banter, that's the speed, that's that sense of life
and
energy.
friendship.
Yes. It perfectly complements that life and energy that you get in the animation, but it also makes the dialogue feel current in a way that not many movies at all feel current right now.
Right.
It's not just a very funny movie.
Yeah.
It's very funny very often.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I just adored this.
But those bits of humor don't interrupt the moments of drama and like seriousness and pathos.
Because it's not this like petrified type of comedy.
It's not afraid to be sincere.
Or mean.
Right.
It's not purely like calculated by lawyers to be self-deprecating so no one can get hurt.
Yeah.
It's just jokes.
Right.
It's
the
fun.
way that actual people talk to, the way that actual teenagers talk to each other.
When they're having that big fight with the vulture in the Guggenheim.
Oh, it's so funny.
And then all of the debris lands and someone said, I think it's a Banksy. Like, that's just a great line.
And the Coons piece shattering, which did actually happen about 6 months ago. Like, very funny. Loved it. I told Cam as we were leaving, I was like, the second they said there's something going on at the Guggenheim, I was like, I'm in.
You said that's a Dean
Koontz.
Dean Koontz. Isn't he a writer?
No, I don't think so.
I definitely read like bad spy fiction by Dean Koontz when I was young.
Maybe, I don't ask me.
I remember.
I'm not a contemporary
who else has
artist.
a last name spelled Koontz or something?
Z, yeah.
I don't know. Leave a comment if I'm
right.
right.
Let us know about Dean Koontz, because I'm not an expert.
I think I read these when I was like weirdly young to be reading like old man Tom Clancy books.
That's hilarious. The other thing I wanted to say, sorry, but going back to the canon piece really quick, I loved that not only was it like having us question, these canon events and how tied are we to them? Sorry, I couldn't think of the word. Right. How tied are we to them? I also liked how there was then the question of, well, can we change it? Right? Because often when you talk about canon and comics and superheroes, you're kind of like, I can't think of the word I'm trying to think of. Like, you're tied to it, right? Like, you're beholden. That's the word.
Oh.
You're beholden to it, right?
What a fun word.
Thank you. I was an English major. But like you're beholden to these canon events. And it's like, well, that's the way it has to go. That's destiny. That's the way the story has to end. Uncle Ben has to die. But Miles just deciding, like, the turning moment of the story, I guess, spoiler, is Miles saying, like, no, like, I'm not going to let that happen.
Right.
And Gwen also deciding, actually, yeah, we're not going to let that happen. Like, we're going to change it, and we're going to do something different because it's 2023 and you can do a different Spider-Man
Breaking
story.
the mold.
Right. But not like in a way of like, I'm going to fix it.
No.
Because the old stories were bad. It's
right.
like, I decided that like, I don't want to do that and I'm in charge of my own story.
And doesn't that feel like another bit of meta observation about what they're doing to the superhero Marvel formula?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I thought this movie was excellent.
Yeah.
I really liked it. Great story, great characters, great dialogue. Obviously, the animation was fantastic. The music was really good too. Whoever the music supervisor was, like they selected great tracks for this.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Also, I loved the Brooklyn scenes and the way Miles is with his friends and his family and like the rooftop party. I was just like, oh,
we're both suckers for New York movies.
We sure are.
But this did feel like one.
It did.
In the same way the games do. Yeah. So this is our little PSA, quick little episode that we found a good multiverse movie. We found a great multiverse
I
movie.
found a great superhero multiverse movie.
Yes, if there are other ones, let us know.
Actually good ones. Don't be like, well, it's no, an actually good movie. You know what I mean. You've been here long enough.
We're on social media at Second Breakfast Pod, and we have bonus episodes, and you can get in touch with us directly over on Substack.
We're doing The Witcher, the last novel of the Witcher series right now. We're also
doing horror movies for Summerween. We're popping off all sorts of episodes right now.
Kinds of things.
And we're about to record 5 or 6 more because we're going out of town.
Yeah, we're trying to bank them.
All right, go check out the movie. Definitely see it in a theater.
It's
really an incredible experience in a theater.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Cool.
All right. Bye.